Persian Gulf, a name reflecting more than 2 millennia of history. In this video you will see the correctness and legitimacy of the Persian Gulf, also known as Gulf of Iran, from historical, international and legal point of view, and with lots of Arabic maps and evidence. There are many historical maps on which the Persian Gulf has been used, but we are going to show you just a few of them dating back to centuries ago. You will also see the viewpoints of the United Nations, the United States, the United Kingdom and the International Hydrographic Organization on the waterway separating Iran, also known as Persia, and Arabian Peninsula. Then you'll see some historical Arabic documents and maps referring to this body of water as Al-Khalij al-Farsi or Bar-e Fars, which means the Persian Gulf, or the Persian Sea, in Arabic. These Arabic maps date back to before rising of Arab nationalism in the mid-20th century. In 1960s, the then Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, proposed that Arabs should use the Arabian Gulf instead of the historical name of Persian Gulf. But you would be surprised when you see one of his handwritten letters in this video. In that letter he referred to this waterway as the Persian Gulf before adopting pan-Arab ideology. And you will also see some important historical and Islamic Arabic books referring to this waterway as the Persian Gulf, including a book that contains a hadith from the Prophet of Islam and a book written by Ibn Taymiyyah, who is respected in Sunni Arab states of the Persian Gulf, especially in Saudi Arabia. There are lots of Arabic books which has referred to this body of water as the Persian Gulf, but for making this video shorter we had to use just a few of them. Actually, for the first time, Greek historians called this body of water the Persian Gulf. Arab Muslims also used the Persian Sea or the Persian Gulf, and the most amazing point is that the Arabic maps referring to this waterway as the Persian Gulf in the Islamic period are more than the Persian ones. This waterway was called the Persian Gulf in the Arab world before 1960s, but with the rise of Arab nationalism, some Arab countries adopted the fabricated term of Arabian Gulf instead of the historical name of Persian Gulf. Part 1, Persian Gulf on the historical maps. If you pay attention to the previous map you will find out an interesting point. Let's take a look at it again. As you saw, on the historical maps the Arabian Gulf has been used as an alternative name for the Red Sea. There are many historical maps referring to the Red Sea as the Arabian Gulf. We are going to show you just some of them. In August 2014, the British Library uploaded over 1 million images on Flickr. There are a lot of maps of the Persian Gulf among the uploaded images. Let's see some of them. And even on some of the uploaded maps by the British Library on Flickr, we can see the term Arabian Gulf has been used as an alternative to the Red Sea. See the following maps. Here is a Turkish atlas referring to this gulf as the Iran Korfzi, meaning Gulf of Iran. Part 2, Viewpoints of UN, USA, UK and IHO on the Persian Gulf. The United Nations only recognizes the historical name of Persian Gulf as the standard name for this body of water. The following maps are of the Middle East and Western Asia on its official website. UN also has requested all of its staff on many occasions to use only the full term of Persian Gulf. Even it rejects using the shorter term of Gulf instead of the Persian Gulf. Here is an official letter by UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, in which it says that only recognizes the Persian Gulf as the name of the sea area between Arabian Peninsula and Iran. It also emphasizes that by using Arab Gulf states it means Arab states of the Persian Gulf. UN Group of Experts on Geographical Names discussed the naming issue during its 23rd session held in Vienna from March 28 to April 4, 2006. It has endorsed Persian Gulf as the official name for this body of water. The United States also recognizes the Persian Gulf as the legal and correct name of this body of water. The United Kingdom also recognizes the Persian Gulf as the legal and historical name of this waterway. The Limits of Oceans and Seas, published by the International Hydrographic Organization, uses the term Gulf of Iran, Persian Gulf. Part 3, Persian Gulf on the historical Arabic maps. As it was mentioned, this body of water has been referred as the Persian Gulf on all the Arabic maps before 1960s, but after rising of Arab nationalism in the mid-20th century, Gamal Abdel Nasser called for using the term Arabian Gulf instead of the Persian Gulf, while prior to 1960s, only the Persian Gulf had been used for referring to this gulf in all the Arab countries. The following Arabic maps using the historical name of Persian Gulf have been collected mostly from Arabic books, magazines or newspapers by the Persian Gulf Studies Center. The book title, author's name and the city and year of publication are written below each map in Persian. As it was said, even Gamal Abdel Nasser had used the Persian Gulf before his pan-Arab ideology. Look at the following letter written by him in which he used the Persian Gulf. And also, the following article in the Egypt school textbooks written by Gamal Abdel Nasser is about Arab unity. He used the Persian Gulf for referring to this waterway in it. Persian Gulf street sign in Cairo. But after rising of Arab nationalism and when Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power, it has been overshadowed by the Arabian Gulf street sign. The Persian Gulf also was used in the treaties and agreements signed between Arab rulers of the Persian Gulf and Britain in the 19th century. Here are copies of the treaties signed between ruler of Kuwait and Britain in the 1899. Even in the Dhahran Treaty, signed between King Abdulaziz, the first king of Saudi Arabia, and Britain on December 26, 1915, the Persian Gulf was used twice. The Prophet of Islam, who was an Arab, has called the waterway between Iran and Arabian Peninsula the Persian Sea. Look at the following hadith. Ibn Taymiyyah, who has had so much influence in Wahhabism, has also used the Persian Sea in his book. The Persian Gulf has also been used in many important Arabic and Islamic books. Here are some of them. Here are the names of just some of the Arabic and Islamic books in which the Persian Gulf has been mentioned. Part 4, Efforts to distort the Persian Gulf and spread a fake name. Although historically, internationally and legally the Persian Gulf is the correct name for the body of water separating Iran, Persia, and Arabian Peninsula, but after 1960s Arabs started denying this fact and tried to change this truth with their petrodollars. In this part we're going to see what they have done to distort and change the historical and international name of Persian Gulf. Please look at the following map very carefully. It's a historical map at a Dubai Museum Said Al Maktoum House. As you found out, the name Persian has been erased from the Persian Gulf phrase on the map. Let's take a look again. Now look at the next map. It's a map at Persia Court in Ibn Battuta Mall in Dubai. At first they covered the Persian Gulf with a piece of paper, but then they decided to. As you witnessed, the term Persian Gulf has been manipulated and changed into the Arabian Gulf. Let's take a look carefully again. In 2004, the term Arabian Gulf was published in the new edition of National Geographic Atlas of the World as an alternative name for the Persian Gulf. This resulted in heavy protests by many Iranians all over the world. It also damaged its international credibility, and as a result, the National Geographic corrected its error. UN group of experts on geographical names mentioned this event in its report. Look at this part. In 2005, we witnessed that the reputable National Geographic Society, with a past history of not accepting and using forged words in its works, distorted the name of Persian Gulf and Iranian islands and intentionally mentioned incorrect information. This action only helped damaging its own international credibility, but ultimately, it surrendered to protests of Iranians throughout the world and corrected its error. In 2004, following the distortion of Persian Gulf by National Geographic, Iranians set up a Google bomb. As a result, anyone searching for the Arabian Gulf on Google found a website with this message: "The Gulf you are looking for does not exist. Try Persian Gulf." In 2006, France's celebrated art and antiquities museum, the Louvre, distorted the historical name of Persian Gulf due to economical ties with Arab states of the Persian Gulf. The Louvre's decision to delete the word Persian came amid intense negotiations aimed at exporting Europe's cultural crown to the heart of the Arab world. For a few years, talks have been underway between Paris and Abu Dhabi to open a branch of the Louvre in the United Arab Emirates. Reportedly, the prestigious museum is set to receive $1 billion to put its elite cultural pieces on display at the branch. Louvre's decision for distorting the historical name of Persian Gulf damaged its reputation and credibility, and in 2007 the Louvre corrected the distorted name of Persian Gulf on the maps and signs. There are very few atlases that still insist on not using the historical term of Persian Gulf, like the Times Atlas of World. But it would be interesting for you to know that these few atlases even do not use the Arabian Gulf for this body of water, because as you saw there is no historical evidence for referring to the Persian Gulf as the Arabian Gulf. So due to the economic ties with Arabs, a few atlases only use the Gulf for referring to this waterway. Some of the media and news agencies like BBC, Reuters and The Economist also use the Gulf instead of the Persian Gulf. Iran banned the sale of The Economist in 2006. But using the Gulf instead of the historical name of Persian Gulf by British atlases and media is not surprising at all, because actually distortion of the Persian Gulf was initiated by the government of England, which suffered a lot from nationalisation of Iran's oil industry in 1950. To compensate its defeat, the government of England published a book by Roderick Owen, who was an agent of English spy organisation. Publishing this book was the beginning of the distortion of the Persian Gulf, and finally in 1966, Sir Charles M. Belgrave, the political agent of England in the Persian Gulf southern states, published a book named Golden Bulbs at Arabic Gulf. Using the unknown term of the Gulf by atlases, museums and Western media is strongly supported politically and economically by Arabic countries. But have you ever asked yourself, why is this waterway sometimes referred briefly as the Gulf, without any adjectival qualification? Well, the answer is clear. In the absence of historical evidence for convincing the world to use a fabricated name instead of the Persian Gulf, Arab governments want to drop the word Persian from the Persian Gulf and spread the unknown term of the Gulf. Google Maps had no name on this body of water, which is the world's largest source of oil and gas. A Google spokesperson told CNN, "It's just simply the case that we don't have a label for every body of water." The spokesperson didn't name any other specific areas that were not labeled. Now, Google Maps uses the Persian Gulf, but when you zoom in, the fabricated term of Arabian Gulf appears in parentheses below it. But what are Arabs' arguments for calling this Gulf something rather than the Persian Gulf? 1. The first reason that usually Arabs give is this: Persian Gulf is linked to the Persian Empire and currently there is no country called Persia. The absurdity of their claim is fully clear, but just for clarifying we should say that Persia is the historical name of Iran, which is still being used. By the way, Iranians have never called their country Persia. Persia, today called Fars, is one of the Iranian provinces in the south of Iran. Actually, Greek historians referred to the Iranian plateau as Persia due to the First Persian Empire, which was originated from Persia in the south of Iran. After Greeks, other historians, including Arabs, kept on calling this land Persia or Fars in Arabic. But since ancient times Iranians have called their country Iran, especially after the Second Persian Empire. 2. The second reason that often Arabs give is this: the people living around this Gulf are Arabs, so it shouldn't be called the Persian Gulf. Let's see if their claim is true or not. Various ethnic groups live in the southern regions of Iran, including Persians, Lurs, Bakshiris. Both of them speak two Iranian languages that are so close to Persian, Arabs and some other minorities. Some Arab tribes emigrated to Iran after the Islamic conquest of Iran and still live there, alongside other ethnic groups, but their population is much less than the large population of Persians, Lurs and Bakshiris living in the south of Iran. Actually, they claim that majority of inhabitants in the south of Iran are Arabs, and for proving their claim, they use photoshopped maps that show all of the southern regions of Iran bordering Persian Gulf, stretching from Khuzestan to the Strait of Hormuz, are part of the so-called Arabic Avaz region. Avaz is just a city in Iran's Khuzestan province which some Arabs coexist with Persians, Lurs, Bakshiris and other ethnic groups. In fact, by telling such lies they want to make their wrong claim, that the people living around the Persian Gulf are Arabs, seem true. But while no historical maps and evidence support what they say about the name of this waterway, they want to spread this wrong and absurd claim which contradicts the reality. But the fact is that Avaz is just a city and the capital of Khuzestan province of Iran. As it was mentioned, some Arabs live there and in some other parts of Iran, but their population is much less than the large population of Persians. We want to show you this part of UN Group of Experts on Geographical Names report. Mr. Rodrikovan should have noticed that on the northern sector of that water body, up to 1,269 kilometers of coast exists with a far larger population who speak Farsi. This is larger than the Arabian population he was concerned about. He did not notice the important fact that the sea was first named by the Greeks and neither Iranian nor Arabs took any part in it. The Muslims and Arab geographers learned the names from the Greeks and Romans, and used it in their works, especially that they named Pars Sea, unanimously, Persian Gulf. And the most amazing point is that instead of using historical maps, they resort to photoshopped ones for proving their wrong claims. But they have not chosen a good excuse. Because, 1, basically their claim is fully wrong. Majority of those who live along the Iranian shore of the Persian Gulf are not Arabs. And according to all of the historical maps, southern regions of Iran, including Khuzestan province and its capital Avaz, have been always part of the Iranian territory since thousands of years ago. 2, an important fact that some Arabs always want to neglect is that all the Arab historians and scholars used the Persian Gulf on their maps or in their books after the Islamic conquest of Iran, which means they used this name decades after the emigration of some Arabs to some regions in Iran. Actually, these Arab historians referred to this Gulf as the Persian Gulf, considering that some Arab tribes live in some of the southern cities of Iran, because they knew that the majority of people living along the Iranian shore of the Persian Gulf are not Arabs. They also knew very well the rich historical background of the Persian Gulf. 3, and finally, the Persian Gulf was used in both English and Arabic versions of the agreement signed in the 19th century between Arab rulers of the Persian Gulf and Britain. So obviously the Arab rulers were fully aware that the Persian Gulf is the correct name of this sea area. And now you may ask, what about the maps that Arabs used to show this waterway has a name rather than the Persian Gulf? Well, we ask you to pay attention to this part of UN Group of Experts on Geographical Names report. It is interesting that from among 6,000 existing historical maps published up to 1890, there are only 3 maps mentioning the names of Basra Gulf, Gadif Gulf, and Arabic Gulf, in addition to which the name of small gulfs located at the coast with local utilization can be also named, such as Shabahar Gulf, Siraf Gulf, Basra Gulf, Gadif Gulf, Bahrain Gulf. But such names are not applied to the entirety of the Persian Gulf. As you read in the UN report, there are very few historical maps that a name rather than the Persian Gulf has been used on them. Most of the maps Arabs use for proving their claim are actually manipulated and fabricated, like the 2 manipulated maps that you saw a few minutes ago. But all the contemporary Arab historians and scholars have not closed their eyes to the reality. Most of them admit that the Persian Gulf is the correct name of this gulf that has been used since hundreds of years ago, even by Arabs. The following article, written by Abdel Azam al-Sheikh, was published on Al Jazeera website on May 9, 2012, in which he admits that the Persian Gulf had been used on all the historical maps before 1960, and then due to Pan-Arabism, Arabs began to refer to the Persian Gulf as the Arabian Gulf. The next one is an article by Ahmad Othman published on Sharq al-Awsat website on September 7, 2010. In this article he says that the Persian Gulf had been the common name for this gulf among Arabs before 1960, and then Arabs began to call this waterway the Arabian Gulf. On November 24, 2005, The Moroccan newspaper of Al Tajdid published an article which said the Persian Gulf was a Zionist term. But later, due to a large number of Arabic and Islamic maps, books and evidence presented to its editor-in-chief by an Iranian history scholar, the newspaper published a correction on December 2, 2005, which says the Persian Gulf has been the correct name of this gulf since 600 BC and has been used in more than 300 Islamic and Arabic books and on more than 1,000 maps, including lots of Arabic ones. Abdelkhalek al-Janabi is a contemporary Saudi history scholar. His article about the Persian Gulf was published on June 16, 2010, on France 24 Observer website, both in English and Arabic. He says, from a scientific and historical point of view, it has been called the Persian Gulf since Alexander the Great, and that it was without foundation to claim Romans named it Arabian Gulf. Things didn't change until Nasser came to power and the rise of Arab nationalism. The Arabs then began to use the name Arabian Gulf. He also adds, it's this name, Persian Gulf, that has been retained by history books and Arab historians, like Ibn Khaldun and Ibn al-Athir. It's also in treaties signed between the governors of the Gulf and the British who dominated the region from the beginning of the 20th century. So as you saw, almost all the Arab scholars, journalists, historians, authors and even Arab leaders know the truth very well. But unfortunately, prejudice and anti-Iranian sentiments and feelings don't let all of them accept this truth. As you know, in the 8 years' war between Iran and Iraq, Saddam Hussein was fully supported by all the leaders of the Persian Gulf Arab states. The fabricated term of Arabian Gulf was used by notorious persons like Saddam Hussein for their anti-Iranian purposes. As you know, Saddam also attacked Kuwait and killed many Sunni Muslims in that Arab country. You may ask, what's the real reason that Arabs still insist on using the forged name of Arabian Gulf instead of the Persian Gulf despite all of the historical Arabic evidence and maps? Well, as you saw, they began to call it the Arabian Gulf because of political disputes, and currently they insist on using this fake name for the same reason. But the fact is that the majority of Arab youth really don't know the truth about the name of this Gulf due to Arab media propaganda. Most of Arab youth don't know that the Persian Gulf was used as the common name of this Gulf in all the Arab countries until the mid-20th century. They've been brainwashed and indoctrinated by Arab leaders and media. For instance, in 2010 the then Secretary General of the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council, known as GCC, said that calling this body of water Persian Gulf is mocked history, because Arab presence in this region goes back 3,000 years, while Persian presence dates only to the Safavid Empire, 1501 to 1736 AD. As you see, he ignored the history of Iran, known as Persia, prior to 1500 AD, and said nothing about the First Persian Empire, which was one of the first civilizations of the world. Here is the map of the First Persian Empire, 500 BC, on the Britannica Encyclopedia website. Sir Arnold Wilson says in a book, published in 1928, that no water channel has been so significant as Persian Gulf to the geologists, archaeologists, geographers, merchants, politicians, excursionists, and scholars, whether in past or in present. This water channel, which separates the Iran Plateau from the Arabia Plate, has enjoyed an Iranian identity since at least 2,200 years ago. But changing the names of seas, oceans and gulfs due to political disputes with other countries is always rejected. Moreover, it's senseless. To understand its absurdity, just imagine that the United States refers to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of Texas or the American Gulf due to a political dispute with Mexico. As you see, it's very meaningless. Naming geographical locations, including gulfs, is an important work that requires knowledge of history. Therefore, political and religious disputes as well as prejudice and preconception should not have any role in it. Any change, destruction, or alteration of the names registered in historical deeds and maps is like the destruction of ancient works and is considered as an improper action. Therefore, the names of geographical features profiting from a unique historical identity should not be utilized as political instruments in reaching a political, tribal, and racial objective, or in any clash with national interests and others' values. Maybe Arab leaders can persuade a few atlases, media and organizations to distort or hide the truth with their petrodollars, but actually they can't cheat the whole world. For instance, This waterway is referred as the Persian Gulf almost in all the important atlases of the world. Even a few other atlases that don't use the Persian Gulf due to their interests and ties with Arab countries, decline to use the fake name of Arabian Gulf too, and they just refer to it as the Gulf. Persian Gulf also is used in all the languages of Wikipedia, except Arabic. But even in the Egyptian Wikipedia it is referred as the Persian Gulf. As you know, Egyptian is a dialect of Arabic. As it was mentioned, even in the Egyptian Wikipedia it is also referred as the Persian Gulf. In the end, we want to advise Arabs, especially Arab youth, to respect hundreds of Arab historians and scholars that have used the Persian Gulf in their works, because these historians and their works are part of the Arabic heritage. Arabs have rich and great culture. We hope that they will build their countries on truth and reality, rather than falsehood and illusion. Manipulating historical maps, distorting history, denying facts and evidence and spreading absurd story contradict their great culture and dignity. And finally we want to draw their attention to this part of UN Group of Experts on Geographical Names report. In the end, it is worth mentioning that the name of Persian Gulf has been admitted in all the live languages of the world so far, and all the countries throughout the world name this Iranian Sea, just in the language of the people, Persian Gulf. Even our Arab brothers do not need to alter a historical name to have a Gulf of their own, because there had been a Gulf in their own name previously mentioned in the historical and geographical works and drawings, which is called at present the Red Sea, Bahr Amr. Persian Gulf is the common heritage of Iranians and Arabs.